So if you follow the debate at the South Carolina State House last year, you know one of the big wins for citizens, for taxpayers, for those of you who care about lower health insurance costs, was the passage of a certificate of need repeal. Now, this got rid of an onerous bureaucratic regulation that limited competition in South Carolina's healthcare marketplace. And one of the key drivers of that reform is sitting with me. Candace, Carroll, your group, Americans for Prosperity, pushed aggressively to get rid of that certificate of need bill. We're already seeing some positive results from that, aren't we?
We are, absolutely. Across the state, immediately, frankly, we saw a number of healthcare providers who were contacting their House reps or their state senator and saying, hey, we want to come into your district. We want to build in your area. So we saw kind of an immediate response there. And then we've also seen some hospital CEOs come out and talk about how this reform was really beneficial to them, because now if they want to get an MRI machine, they can just go and get one, and they can be nimble to the needs of their community and not have to go through that bureaucratic red tape, which is just phenomenal for patients and citizens across the state. And, you know, when we think about that bureaucratic red tape, just the onerous process that it was, we saw hospitals sometimes who were caught up in litigation for 15, 20 years, and it's the patients and that really lost out in that situation. And so we were excited to be part of the forefront of that bill moving through last year, getting passage, the governor signing it really quickly to put it into place. And then we've continued to see just the healthcare space explode when it comes to providers wanting to come into the market, but also our elected officials continuing to lean into what we at AFP call a personal option when it comes to healthcare. So getting government out of the way and putting the ownership of healthcare back into the hands of patients and their physicians.
Well, we're going to dive into a couple of big healthcare issues you guys are focused on this session. But first, I wanted to switch gears just briefly. I want to talk a little bit about this education reform effort here in the Palmetto State. As you know, soaring costs here in South Carolina, the taxpayer obligation, over $17,500 per kid per year. It's before we even get to debt and spending from bond issues. Yet we're not seeing results. South Carolina falling further behind on the nation's report card in AEP. Those scores simply not commensurate with that massive new investment. You guys are behind a major school choice bill that's focused on what are known as ESAs. I wondered if you could walk us, Candace, through that bill. What are ESAs? Why would they be an ideal solution for fixing South Carolina's academic woes?
So this is something that I have had the opportunity to work on since I came in to join AFP's team in South Carolina in 2017. This idea that parents should be in charge of their students' education, not necessarily the system, the school system. We have some really good schools in South Carolina, but as you mentioned, we're not always getting the return on that investment. So what this bill does is it really opens up the opportunity for what we call education scholarship accounts, to where the money, as you mentioned, Will, that is going into this greater pot and then divided out by students, that parents could have access to that. It's already their money anyway. It's taxpayer dollars. It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the taxpayers. And parents could then use that to send their kid to the educational environment that's the best opportunity for them. Maybe that is a public school in a neighboring district, and you could use that funding to pay for those district fees to change from one district to another. Or maybe it's sending your kid to a private school that has a specialty in, you know, an academic program your kid's really interested in. Or maybe you've got a kiddo like mine. I'm a mom to a special needs kiddo who needs additional therapy services or tutoring services. And those services are expensive regardless of what your personal income is. And so you could use this funding for that and to go towards any sort of educational service that might be the best opportunity for your kids. We know at AFP that every kid has a unique skill set, a unique talent, and it's really nonsensical to think that like we should just push every kid into the public school that they are zip code zoned for, and that's going to be the best opportunity for them. That's crazy talk. And the way that our school systems are still currently set up is almost to like teach kids how to go work in a factory type setting. They sit in a desk from 8 to 2. They've got to do like seated work requirements, and not every kid learns that way. And the workforce is changing as well, to where like not every industry wants people who can just like sit and do seated work from 8 to 2. There's a lot of collaboration happening, a lot of hands-on learning, a lot of unschooling, if you will. And so we at AFP support all of the above options when it comes to education, and think this is a great opportunity for students and parents to really be excited about their kids' education and let them own a little bit as to like what that looks like. And this is something that's not unique to South Carolina. We have seen really post-COVID where parents started to lean in more to their kids' education when they were all forced to, juggle working from home and teaching their kids and helping them log on to Zoom and all of these things. And a lot of parents started to pay even more attention as to what was happening in their kids' classroom and learning more about their kids' own learning styles at that point. So you've seen a lot of states, Florida, Arizona, Tennessee, Iowa, just state after state after state, that have really gone towards putting parents and students in the driver's seat of that education. So this bill is really exciting in that there's no income eligibility cap like there have been in previous bills that have been introduced. Even the micro program that they passed last year, there was an income eligibility cap. So that opens it up completely. The other thing,
more universal.
More universal, exactly, in eligibility. The other thing that I'm really excited about in this bill is that you have a lot of kiddos now across the state who already attend private schools, but they can't apply for the micro ESA program that passed last year because that bill required a prior year of public school attendance. And so, it would be crazy to think like, well, I want you to take your kid from private school, put them in public school for a year, then you can apply and you can go back. So this bill gets rid of that prior year of public school requirement. So you have a lot of families who already are maybe getting assistance from the private school that they send their kid to, that they could then apply for these funds and use it towards that. And so, we shouldn't be asking parents to pick between putting groceries on the table or paying for their kids' education. They should be able to do both. And so in this bill would really open that up. And the other thing I think that's unique about this is, as I mentioned, I've worked on this type of concept for years. But this year, it has the support of the speaker, and it has the support of the House Majority Leader and of Chair Lady Erickson. And so you're seeing the leadership shift in the House, whereas previously that wasn't the case with our former speaker. And so really exciting to see the subcommittee hearing scheduled for today, and then the full committee hearing scheduled for tomorrow, assuming it passes out of subcommittee today. So it's going to be something that goes through the House and then goes over to the Senate. And well, we're in an election year. It would behoove our senators to take up something like this in an election year, knowing that parents are the ones that are going to be going to the polls to vote for them in a lot of their primaries come June.
Absolutely. And let's look over at the Senate. Obviously, you guys have been working very hard in that chamber related to a healthcare consolidation bill. And we talked earlier about the getting rid of some of these onerous anti-competitive regulations. Now, looking at the structure of how we govern healthcare in South Carolina, taking 6 agencies down to 1. Candace, walk us through this reform bill. What does it do? How would it, again, rearrange this alphabet soup maze of bureaucracy?
So I go back to these agencies didn't talk to each other. So you had a Department of Mental Health, a Department of Behavioral Health, a department that dealt with drug treatment for folks, and some others as well. But what was happening is patients were unfortunately falling through the cracks because there was no requirement between the agencies to talk to each other. So maybe you're an individual who needs access to mental health treatment, but also drug treatment, and you're on the wait list for both, and maybe you get approved from one agency and you're still waiting on the other. So this consolidation bill really will help in the fact that all of the agencies now are under one umbrella, tearing up to one individual who is held accountable by the governor, which is whom the constituents vote to put into office. So right now, the kind of leader of DHEC is appointed by the DHEC board. There's no accountability to the taxpayers in that regard. The person could be in office and the leader of DHEC for as long as the board wanted them to be there. There's no hiring and firing or accountability. But if you have someone who is appointed by the governor, regardless of who that governor is, there's going to be accountability there from voters because voters are the ones who put the governor into office. And so you're going to have greater accountability in that that space. You're going to have greater transparency for patients, and you're going to have the opportunity to make sure that patients no longer fall through the cracks because the agencies simply don't talk to each other. And again, I mentioned a little earlier, I'm a mom to a special needs kiddo, and I'm down here in Columbia a lot, and I have the ability to go knock on someone's door if I'm like, hey, where's my kid on this wait list, right, of getting services. Not everyone has that ability, and I fully understand that. And so what we need to do is get rid of the bureaucratic red tape that's holding up patients from being able to get the treatments that they need to live a life that is the most fulfilling to them. And so where we can provide that accountability and transparency, we absolutely should. So as you mentioned, the Senate passed this bill. The House passed a similar version as well. So we'll see what happens with those two. If the, opposite chambers take it up, if it goes to conference committee is what I'm expecting. But there's a real appetite, again, to put the patients in the driver's seat of their own healthcare. And this bill, I think, absolutely does that.
When you talked about some of the leading members of the House of Representatives supporting education, on this bill, you've got Senate Finance Chairman Harvey Peeler, a lead sponsor, Senate President Thomas Alexander, a lead sponsor. You got Tom Davis, one of the lead authors of this healthcare restructuring bill. So there's some real firepower from the Senate on this legislation.
There is on the Senate side. And you see some of our policy champions who have been there on the Certificate of Need repeal as well. Wes Clymer, he's also a big proponent of reducing the bureaucratic red tape. And then on the House side, you had House leadership in favor of getting rid of, of really consolidating these agencies as well. So it's a big opportunity. And it's something that I hope that patients will continue to lean into as this discussion continues throughout the remainder of session.
When you did mention the possibility for a conference committee, a likelihood of a conference committee dealing with the differences between the House and the Senate on this, one question I did want to ask you, there are those who have alleged that this legislation would give new powers to this director of health, gubernatorially appointed position over independently elected sheriffs, particularly concerned about in the aftermath of COVID and some of the top-level, top-heavy dictates that were handed down from above on local governments and municipalities. Are you concerned about that as you look at this legislation?
No, I'm not. And I heard that discussion last week on the House floor talking about there was an amendment of we should just give discretions to sheriffs. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm a little weary of giving discretion to sheriffs when it comes to a number of things. We see the space that they operate in when it comes to civil asset forfeiture, where they have a lot of discretion. And I'm not in favor of giving them discretion when it comes to the healthcare space. But what I think this does is it gives them accountability of if there is a state of emergency and we need to, put something into place like we did during COVID, having the ability to where they can work with the health department to make sure that is taken care of. We've seen outbreaks when it comes to tuberculosis at public schools over the past few years. And so should that be at the discretion of the sheriff to decide whether or not we should take action in a case like that? Or should we have someone who is responsible and who has a medical background and oversees a healthcare agency to be able to lean in there? And so I've heard those concerns from some folks, and I've heard, the discussion on the House floor, but I don't know that is accurate. And the concerns that folks have, I would lean more so in the space of I don't know that we should be giving discretion to sheriffs when it comes to a number of things, but in particular, the healthcare space.
Well, let's now talk about one of those things. I don't want to dog on law enforcement too much in this interview. Obviously, you and I are very supportive of that core function of government, but we're going to talk a little bit about medical marijuana now. Obviously, another bill you guys have been closely following and supporting. Tom Davis, another bill that he's been a leader on for the past decade, trying to get this through. Obviously, it has passed the state Senate again, the second time in the last 3 years that this legislation has cleared the state Senate by a sizable bipartisan majority of votes in the Senate. House still hasn't set a vote for it. Candace, are we going to finally get this bill across the finish line through the House of Representatives?
So I am cautiously optimistic that we will, because we have seen this speaker take up a number of things over this past legislative session, his inaugural term as speaker, that have been large transformative pieces of legislation that, I think people were a little surprised to see him take up the repealing of certificate of need as one. We've now seen this massive school choice bill coming through. He's got a big energy bill he's working on as well. So I think that the appetite is there in the House to do something. And again, if we're talking about healthcare and giving patients access to healthcare, to me, this falls under that same bucket of letting patients have the ability to talk with their physician about what is the best course of action for them when it comes to treatment. There's bukus of research out there about the efficacy of medical cannabis when it comes to PTSD, when it comes to epilepsy, autism, and the list goes on and on. And so, like, who are we as individuals, or who is the government
Can
to
I take
get
it for
in
my
between?
fibromyalgia, though?
Well, there's a limited number of qualifications in this bill. So talk to the bill sponsor about expanding that. But currently there's limited number in there. But I think, like, who is the state government to get in between a physician and a patient? And that's the conversation that's happening with a lot of these healthcare bills. So if we continue to think about it from that frame of reference, then I hope that the House will actually move on the bill. Now, it is a Senate bill, so we may not see it move until after crossover, just given, that they need to get some House bills through over the next month. But there's an appetite from the veteran community in the House, members who, have served there, from the healthcare committee in the House. So we'll see. Again, this is a different healthcare committee than when the bill was heard in the House in 2022. We have a new chair lady, in Celeste Davis, who has been a huge proponent of really putting patients in charge of their own access to healthcare. So I am cautiously optimistic that we will see a vote on it this year. I would love for there to be one.
A lot of folks really hoping that this is the year. 38 states have passed some
Right.
form of decriminalization. South Carolina, obviously, this is one of the more conservative bills, Senator Davis calls it. Physicians have to prescribe it. Pharmacies have to dispense it. It is a very tightly regulated piece of legislation. Let me shift gears on you again, Candace. I want to ask you about an issue this week. We are going to see the first judicial election in a long time here in South Carolina, a new Supreme Court Chief Justice here in South Carolina, John Kittredge, scheduled vote this week. As we look at his ascension to this role, obviously we've seen over the past decade under former Chief Justice Beatty, we've seen a bit of an erosion of public faith in the judiciary. Again, not all his fault. Certainly don't want to single him out
Right.
For all of it, but we have seen that erosion of public trust due to so many of the questionable bonds, questionable sentencing, the delays in the docket. It's just a huge problem on multiple facets. But let me ask you this question. You guys are involved in this judicial reform fight. What is the fix that you want to see, particularly as it relates to judicial selection and how we pick judges in South Carolina?
So this issue is an interesting one because it's not one that I think a lot of people were paying attention to until, as you mentioned, the past few years when things have started to pop up, people getting let out early on sentences who probably shouldn't have been let out, and people truly understanding the role that the legislature plays in picking judges here in South Carolina, which is very different than a lot of other states and how that operates. So some states have popular election. I would not advocate for that. I think that gets messy real quick. So what we would love
But
to...
would you advocate for at least part of like, let's say there's a proposal that has a gubernatorial appointment and legislative...
Yes, absolutely. So that's what we would like to see, is a more federal-like type system. Obviously not asking the House to give up their ability to confirm these judges, but having the opportunity for there to be a gubernatorial appointment when it comes to potentially, or at least a nomination of who the governor would like to see in some of these seats, which is what we see at the federal level, where the president nominates, the Senate then confirms. So having some sort of system like that, where there is an accountability between all the branches when it comes to, the House side, House chamber, Senate chamber, and the governor's office. The other piece that is really interesting is right now in South Carolina, there is a cap of 3 judges when you're talking about the Judicial Merit Selection Commission. Let's say there's 9 applicants who apply to be, the judge for a circuit court. The JMSC right now only passes through 3 names to the General Assembly. So what happens to the other 6, right? Or were they qualified?
All qualified, yeah.
Or were they not? If they were all qualified, we would prefer a system that passes through all of those who are qualified. Now, still giving the JMSC the opportunity to rule out those who were not. They certainly serve a purpose, and that body, in particular the JMSC, is in our state constitution, that we have to have one. What the structure of that looks like is up for the General Assembly to decide, but we do have to have a selection commission of some kind. So, but we would love to see that cap lifted off. If they're all qualified, send them all through and let the legislative branch work through that process at that point versus just holding it back and saying like these three are the best, or here's two bad candidates and here's one that's really good. And so thinking through like what that could look like when it comes to that piece of it, when it comes to the accountability that is on the Judicial Merit Selection Commission, there's been a lot of discussion as to who should sit on that. Should it be heavy in the lawyer legislative space like it is right now? Should there be an opportunity for more appointments? Should there be, an opportunity for a retired judge to sit there? Like all of these conversations as to like who should make up that committee. To us, we're watching some of that to decide like who should make that up. We haven't really played a big role in that, but more so a role in having there be some sort of executive involvement in the process, having there be like lift the cap of, the number of qualified applicants that can go through the process. And then the other piece too, that I don't know that a lot of the general public sees, is I'm at the State House every day that these guys are in session. And the number of judges that I see standing in the lobby calling members out to try to get their vote, following them through the garage, hanging around, very undignified. They don't have to be registered as a lobbyist like everyone else does who's in the lobby, yet they're there just as much, if not more. And so that process is just very gross to me. And there has to be a way to get around that piece of it. And I certainly understand that they need the votes of their senators and of their House members in order to get these judgeships. But there's got to be a better way to do it than like they can just hang out at the lobby and call members to the rope when they're debating other things to try to get their votes.
Senator Dick Harpootlian obviously has been very outspoken in opposition to that current undignified process.
Right.
Must be his prickly demeanor. He must not enjoy that back and forth. Let me ask you this, though. You mentioned Senator Wes Clymer earlier in our conversation, big supporter of many of the bills that you guys have advanced. Senator Clymer, I interviewed him the other day about this judicial reform debate, and one of the comments he made to me was that the hill that reformers are going to have to storm is that lawyer-legislator presence on JMSC. And one of the things he mentioned to me is that debate, according to him anyway, is what will separate the reformers from, quote, everybody else.
Right.
As you guys look at that selection process and the influence of lawyer legislators, obviously there's a perception problem, but wouldn't getting lawyer legislators off the JMSC at least eliminate the perception of undue influence?
I think it would eliminate the perception of it. What you have right now is you have lawyer legislators who serve on the JMSC, so they're part of that nomination process of deciding which of those judicial candidates get to go on to their colleagues to be voted on. And then they get to vote on those individuals on the floor, and then they get to go and practice before those individuals that they then voted on. So, if we're talking about an incestuous system, it has the appearance of one, at least. Not claiming that there are bad actors there, but it certainly could give the appearance that there are. You do have some folks, and Senator Billy Garrett mentioned this in the Senate committee meeting last week, that he recuses himself if he has put a judge into a seat that he then is supposed to practice before, that he recuses himself so that there's no perception of a conflict of interest. Not all of his colleagues do that. And so where there's that opportunity and that discussion to say, okay, but should you get to practice before the judge that you put there? And what if the person who is on the other side didn't have that same ability to then put the judge there that they are practicing in front of? And that judge is up for reelection. Does your ability to get to practice in front of them determine whether you reelect them or not, or how they ruled on your cases? And so there's a lot of conversation happening in that piece of, should lawyer legislators sit on the JMSC at all? There was also an amendment in Senate committee last week of, should legislators at all get to sit on the JMSC? Or should that just be by appointment? Maybe the speaker could appoint someone, but not someone from the General Assembly. Michael Johnson was spearheading that idea last week in the Senate as to what that should look like. especially if they get to be the ones that confirm the judges. Should they also get to be the ones on the JMSC that are involved in nominating them to go before their colleagues? So it should be an interesting debate over at the Senate this week on the Senate floor. We anticipate, of course, amendments to what came out of committee. We'll see what those amendments kind of look like, what kind of airtime that they get, and then what the appetite is in the House. As I mentioned, they have their own version of judicial reform coming through, a committee meeting later this week, where 60 of the 124 House members are signed on as co-sponsors to the bill currently. Bipartisan support, so that bill will likely move very quickly. It's similar to what the Senate has in front of them before on the floor this week, but we'll see what, the devil's always in the details, Will, as to what that looks like.
A lot of momentum, though.
A lot of momentum. And I think rightfully so, because you have constituents now who are paying attention to this. And again, we're in an election year, and people are now understanding that the person that they elect to serve them as their state senator or their state House rep is the person who puts the judges there. And if you don't understand that process when you're going to vote on someone, to say like, okay, not only am I voting for someone who I think can draft good policy or be a good policy champion on healthcare, education, or whatever, but I'm voting for someone who is going to put the judges before us in South Carolina. That's a very different type of like mental gymnastics that you have to do when you're in front of the ballot box.
Absolutely. You mentioned it's an election year. Let's talk about that a little bit. There are two senators over the last 2 months who have announced that they will not be standing for re-election in 2024. One of them in a district that could be viewed as a swing district, District 35 there, based in Sumter, but incorporates parts of Lee, parts of Richland, a district that is going to be potentially very competitive for the Republican Party. Obviously, Senator Nikki Setzler, after 48 years, is stepping down. That district is one that, again, could be seen as potentially competitive. But let me ask you this question. As we look at supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, effectively in the Senate, we look at Republican candidates in primary elections. That's where the battle in most of these instances is going to be fought. You look at these seats, you look at these openings. Is AFP going to get involved in some of those races?
So our CEO has been very clear since February of last year when she put out a memo talking about AFP's involvement in primaries, that we're looking to be involved in primaries up and down the ballot. So yes, would be the short answer to your question. What that looks like, we are still building out. But I think in South Carolina, that's where the play is in a lot of these seats. Some of them will be competitive in a general election, but most of the time, for our state legislative seats, given the majorities that we have, the primaries are where the plays are. And there's a number of open seats in addition to the one that you mentioned over in the House side, some members who have decided that they're not running for re-election for their current seat for a variety of reasons. Some are choosing to retire or step down. Others are choosing to run for a higher office and also not trying to run for their House seat at the same time. So we are taking a look at some of those, kind of to see what the landscape is across the state. And again, our CEO is very clear as of over a year ago now, saying that we're looking to play up and down the ballot. So don't count us out with these primary elections coming up in June.
And then AFP Action obviously could get involved at the congressional level?
Yes, potentially. So our PAC, AFP Action, is taking a look at congressional seats across the state. Here in South Carolina, they've already announced a number of congressional races and Senate races that they're involved in across the country. So there could potentially be an opportunity here. Of course, there's an open seat in CD3 with Jeff Duncan saying he's not running for re-election. You've got potentially a contentious race in District 4, District 1, there's already some opposition. So, taking a look at kind of the landscape there. So I would say continue to lean in to like AFP, what we might do on the state leg side. And then AFP Action, of course, is looking at some of those seats, not just here in South Carolina, but across the country.
Absolutely. Candace, Carroll, every time you come on, I learn something new, not only about the political environment, but more importantly about these key policy debates that are taking place at the State House that really impact folks' lives. Thank you so much for coming in.
Of course.
Bringing us up to speed on everything you guys are working on, and good luck on these bills. And you'll come back in and share some updates with us?
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. I appreciate you guys and the coverage that you give to these issues at the State House, because a lot of them are very nuanced issues that are hard to talk about. And so I appreciate the work that you guys do to try to get, judicial reform being one out there in layman's terms so people can understand like what is actually going on at the State House. So thank you again for having me.
Well, you're welcome anytime. Thanks again, Candace.